continue talking about the digestive system, and we finished last class with this, right? We talked about the tooth and stuff like that. So essentially our discussion of digestive system will be pretty much following the route that food takes. It goes through the alimentary tract, and the next stop for us would be in the pharynx and esophagus. Those are pretty small parts. So the pharynx, or as we call it, a throat, you can see it right here. It's colored in 3 different colors: the blue, the purple. By the way, speaking of colors, I always have a problem. Is that what I'm pointing at here? Is that purple or violet? It's purple. Okay, thank you very much, because my son told me find something purple. I told him tough luck, dude, because I cannot tell them. I mean, I see the difference, I just don't know which one's which. So blue is nasopharynx, okay. The purple is oropharynx. So pretty much oropharynx is next to the oral cavity. And the green one is laryngopharynx, okay, next to the larynx, okay. So well, sorry, no, that's the larynx. That's going to be laryngopharynx. So 3 parts, right? Nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, parts of the throat. I misled you a little. The blue, of course, is the nasal cavity, okay. Now, these 3 parts, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, all 3 of them play a role in the respiration, obviously, because when you inhale, water goes through the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, all the way down into larynx and trachea. In terms of digestion, only one part of the throat doesn't play a role in it, and it's going to be nasopharynx. Does that make sense? So this pretty much upper part doesn't play a role normally. So when food enters the pharynx, it goes directly into the oropharynx part, okay, proceeds into the laryngopharynx part, and then from the laryngopharynx enters the esophagus. Now, the questions that we want to ask ourselves regarding the physiology of the swallowing process, the deglutition process: how does that happen? Why food doesn't go up into the nasopharynx, okay, and why food doesn't end up in the respiratory tract, okay. Now, for this, we need to figure out how nervous system regulates the swallowing process. First of all, I want to ask you, swallowing, is that a voluntary act? I did it just right now, swallowed, okay? You can swallow. Swallowing. Like, can you swallow something, or can you spit it out? Yes, right? You control it. Does that make sense what I say? But parts of it, some of the parts are voluntary and others are not. So when you swallow, you essentially use your tongue to move the food towards the pharynx. So move the food this way, okay? You move the food this way using tongue. Does that make sense? Now, when food enters oropharynx, and as it is moved towards the oropharynx, you can see on this illustration right here, that's the food, okay? Its pressure is sensed by branches of trigeminal nerve, okay, which sends the sensory input to the swallowing center located in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. Okay? The swallowing center generates the motor response, which I'm going to show as red, okay, through the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, and that motor response involves several actions. First of all, we have to prevent food from going into your nose, into your nasopharynx, right? This is done by elevating the uvula here, which closes. We'll see it one more time, okay? Which closes nasopharynx, preventing food from going into your nose. Does that make sense? Second, gets motor response to the epiglottis right here, which closes the larynx, preventing food from entering the respiratory tract. That's why, for example, one of the things that is not recommended to breastfeeding women is to feed the baby when they are in the car. When they are riding the car, obviously, Somebody drives the car and their passengers in the back seat, and they feed the baby with a bottle or breastfeeding a baby. If there is a bump, then milk will not be swallowed, but can be pretty much jump directly here, and then it's kind of a lottery where it's going to end up. If it ends up in the respiratory tract, in the best case scenario, baby will cough. Yes? Oh no, baby controls it, but think about this. When you have a food in your mouth, and I don't know, if you start jumping or shaking, food may get through the throat, okay, get to the larynx without your intentions. It just falls through. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. Yes, that can happen. You're not swallowing at this moment, and the hit may force the food to go in the wrong place. There are examples like that. Okay, people do that. Pretty much. Yep. Sometimes jumping, playing things. Okay. So that's why you have to be careful when you eat. Now, and then when the food ends up here, okay, not in the larynx, but in laryngopharynx, there is a sphincter between the esophagus and the pharynx. The sphincter relaxes, opens up, and the food enters the esophagus. Okay. Now we're gonna, speaking of anatomy of these parts, actually, what type of epithelium do you think lines up these three parts of the throat? So you have nasopharynx, okay? Let's go with nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Nasopharynx, its function is what? Breathing, yes. What type of epithelium would you put there? Okay, you would put squamous. What about the number of layers? Air rubs against it so much, right? It should be simple. It doesn't. The only thing that comes through normally is the air. So it's simple. It's not actually squamous. It's pseudo-stratified, which means it's simple columnar with some bells and whistles. Okay, so simple. Now, what is the function of oropharynx and laryngopharynx? Digestion and respiration. So food that you swallow, does it rub? Yeah. So stratified squamous. Non-keratinized, it's not a skin, okay? But still, it's stratified squamous epithelium. Does that make sense? Skeletal muscle in the throat kind of promotes swallowing, okay? What else? Mucous membrane, of course. The entire surface of your alimentary tract is covered with mucous membrane. so I don't even think it, worth mentioning. Now let's see again the mechanics of swallowing. So this green stuff right here is the food. So when you move the food towards the back of the oral cavity, towards the throat, the mechanoreceptors in the walls of the throat and in the soft palatii sense the pressure, send the signal to the medulla. We don't have a picture of medulla, so I'm going to send the signals here, okay? Does that make sense? Medulla produces the response, which is first closing the nasopharynx. You pretty much can see it is closed there. If you want, somebody can just dim the light and it's going to be easier to see. Generate, do you mind? There's a dimmer. Yeah, the bottom one. The bottom one, yeah. Yeah, good, awesome. Okay? Is that good? Nobody's going to fall asleep? You good? All right, so you see the uvula closes the nasopharynx. Okay? Epiglottis, at the same time, closes the laryngopharynx. Okay? And the sphincter, which is not really well seen, but sphincter is right here, it opens. So the food now can enter the esophagus. Does that make sense? When food is in the esophagus, sphincter closes. So don't have food going backwards. Does that make sense? And then food is moved down the esophagus by peristaltic wave. Essentially, it works the same way as when you squeeze the paste out of the tube. Just squeezes the bolus of food down towards the stomach. Okay? And as food approaches the stomach, there's another sphincter right here. Okay? When food approaches it, sphincter opens and food enters the stomach. Well, stomach will be eventually the point of discussion. So far, what do you have to, and I will ask you questions about that. You have to understand the mechanics of swallowing. Okay? The sensory input from mechanoreceptors goes to the medulla oblongata. And medulla generates the response, the muscular response, closing the nasopharynx with uvula, closing larynx with epiglottis, and opening upper esophageal sphincter. So this one is called upper esophageal sphincter. Well, quite logically, this one is called lower esophageal sphincter, or another name for it, gastroesophageal. That makes sense? Between the stomach and the esophagus. Any questions, anything that is not clear with that mechanics? Now, once you start swallowing, you can initiate it voluntarily, but once you start it, can you stop it? Not really, no. I mean, it's going to go through. So how do we call this type of response in the body when you have receptor, sensory input, then something, pretty much CNS, okay? CNS, motor output, and muscle. This whole thing. Reflex, that's a reflex arch, right? That's the reflex. Does that make sense? That's the swallowing reflex. Deglutition reflex. Deglutition is a fancy word for swallowing. Does that make sense? Great. Moving on. Esophagus is boring tube. It's about 10 inches long, muscular. When there's no food inside, it's pretty much collapsed. So you see this white part that I contour. This white part is the lumen of esophagus, and it's almost gone when there's no food, so it's stretchable. Okay. Stratified squamous epithelium, because think about this: things that you swallow, they're pretty tough, right? Like peels. Think about it. Peels. Sometimes it's a powder, some sugars, like a rocky thing and stuff like that. So to prevent damage, okay, we have obviously stratified squamous epithelium. You can see the strata of the cells. Okay. When it has 4 layers, so you have mucosa, the one that I obscured by the line that I draw, the red line. Okay, you can see the mucosal cells here. Okay. Then it has submucosa, which is pretty much loose areolar connective tissue. 2 layers of muscles. So you see the longitudinal and the circular layer. And on the outside, it's not serosa, it's adventitia. The difference: serosa makes fluid, adventitia doesn't. So just a dense connective tissue on the outside. On this micrograph, you kind of see the traces of adventitia here. Okay, it keeps it in place, essentially. Keeps esophagus in place. Does that make sense? It's 4 layers. That's it. Okay. The muscles in the upper third of the esophagus, surprisingly, are skeletal muscles. And as we progress down through the esophagus, skeletal muscles are being substituted by smooth, and by the bottom third, it's entirely smooth muscles in the muscularis externa. Now, one interesting thing, in my opinion, about esophagus and then stomach is the transition point. So, yeah, we don't see that on those guys or gals, but if we will try to make like a schematic drawing, this is the esophagus and this is the stomach. Okay, so this is the junction between them. Right, that's food falls out of the esophagus, and this opening, this junction, is controlled by the gastroesophageal sphincter. Gastroesophageal sphincter, okay, which is also called a cardiac sphincter. And the part of the stomach right next to esophagus here is called cardia. And this opening of esophagus into the stomach is called cardiac orifice. Orifice is opening. Now my question is, why cardia? Does it have anything to do with the heart? No, not really, except for one thing. Yeah, it's pretty close, kind of, sort of. So that's why, how do we call the moment when gastric juices splash into the esophagus? How do we call it? Heartburn, because when we didn't know anatomy, we thought it's a heart. Okay, so the name stuck. It's technically a misnomer, but we just call it this way. Okay. Now this gastroesophageal reflex that I mentioned, the moment when fluid from the stomach, which is very acidic, splashes into the esophagus, why? Why reflex? What can cause it? What? Mechanically, so we just discussed the food. Okay, let's go back for a second. Food, by peristalsis, okay, by peristalsis it moves down the esophagus, okay, moves down, goes through the sphincter, enters the stomach. So why? What is the reason? Huh? There you go. Yeah, when sphincter is not closed completely, then you can get splashes back, okay? Acidity is too high. Sometimes it also, when it's really high acidity, it creates, irritates the stomach, so it kind of prevents the orifice from closing. Yes, sphincter from closing.
So, like, what if you have to vomit? How does that, like...
If you have to vomit?
Yeah, how does that
Great. We'll talk about vomiting, but briefly what happens is you have a certain stimulus. Usually it's irritation. It can be obstruction, like a bowel obstruction. Depends on where the obstruction is. You may or may not vomit. Okay. Pretty much this irritation goes into the vomiting center, which is also in medulla. Vomiting center sends the mechanical response, okay, motor response to the muscles that start to work in the opposite direction. Okay, and the entire thing, the peristalsis, the esophagus, starts to move food in the opposite direction. Does that make sense? That's pretty much it.
Like, will it ever reach the stomach? Will it come back out of the stomach? Or...
What exactly?
Let's say, like, you ate, like,
Crap.
a bad food.
Okay.
Kind of, like, spoiled food.
Yes.
And, like, 30 minutes later, you, like, start to feel nauseous and everything. Like, has it hit your stomach yet or no?
Oh yeah, it's practically it's there in the minutes.
Okay.
So I mean, you swallow it and it goes in the stomach in minutes.
Would it come back up from the stomach then, if you were to vomit? Or...
Yeah, if you're gonna vomit, whatever you ate will get out of the stomach.
I just didn't know, like, if it like stayed in the esophagus, that's how you could throw it up.
Okay.
Or if it came through.
It doesn't stay in esophagus. It makes the entire way down to the stomach. Okay. Esophagus, the only secretion that esophagus produces actually is it has glands in the submucosa here that produces the secretion that lubricates the food, so eases it to come through. But going back to the orifice, and I will talk about vomiting and stimulating vomiting. So this junction between the esophagus and the stomach, okay, it's very highly magnified cross section. So what you can see here, and I think it's quite fascinating, the epithelium of esophagus is stratified squamous epithelium. See here? That's epithelium. Now, when stomach starts, epithelium immediately changes to the columnar. It's just striking the difference, okay? When esophagus stops and stomach starts, epithelium, there's no transitional point. It becomes columnar, simple columnar epithelium. And we will see that functions of the epithelium in the esophagus is protection, while the function of epithelium in the stomach is secretion. There's not pretty much no absorption there, but a lot of secretion. Does that make sense? Now, on the topic of vomiting, so your question was, will it help to... So you asked, if you eat spoiled food and you feel nauseous and you start to vomit, will the food go out or it's already gone from the stomach? Depends on how long it took. Transition time for stomach, as far as I remember, is about 2 hours. So if you ate something in the morning and feel nauseous in the evening, then food is already in the intestine. So it's kind of unfortunate event. But one of the great examples of stomach irritation is alcohol. If you overconsume alcohol, you feel nauseous, okay? Well, due to multiple actually reasons, not only to the stomach irritation, but including stomach irritation. So you get in another portion and it immediately comes out. Okay, you get in another portion, it immediately comes out. Does that make sense? So that's why one of the advice that people give to those who accidentally overconsume it, okay, is to cause vomiting. Because if you keep drinking, alcohol stays in your stomach for some time, okay? And if you really feel that it's probably too much, getting rid of what is in the stomach not yet absorbed may not be a bad idea. You're not going to become completely sober, but at least you're going to get rid of some of it, some of the toxin, because this is toxin. Does that make sense? Did I answer? Awesome. We're going to wrap it up now. We're going to talk about stomach on Wednesday, and we're going to look at some slides and so on.